Good afternoon. I call to order this meeting of the Housing Policy and Development Committee. I'm Councilmember Cam Gordon. I'm chair of the committee, and I'm joined by Vice Chair, Councilmember Ellison, and Councilmembers Goodman and Schrader. We're a quorum of the committee, so we can get started. I expect more committees members to arrive soon. We may also be joined by some other council members for a presentation. I think what I'm going to do with the agenda, though, is I'm going to put the consent agenda first, and then we'll do the public hearings for our land sales, and so we'll end with the presentation. I don't expect the public hearings will go that long. So let's start with the consent items. That starts with item number 6, and this is approving some council reappointments for 3-year terms to the Minneapolis Public Housing Authority. This would be Faith Zhang for seat 8 from Ward 5 and James Rosenbaum from seat 7, and also waiving the residency requirement for James. The 7th item is acknowledging receptivity to a Livable Communities Act funding award, form in support of the award of the Metropolitan Community Livable Communities Local Housing Incentive Account grant funds to the PPL Greenbelt Homes New Construction Project. The 3rd item is extending exclusive development rights for Sherman Associates West Broadway Curve Project. The next consent item, 9th on our agenda, and welcome Councilmember Reich has joined us, is the 2017 Metropolitan Council Livability Communities Demonstration Account and Transit-Oriented Development Grant Awards. Then we have the 10th item on our consent agenda is the multifamily rental dwellings advance notice of sales. This is just referring the subject matter of an ordinance amendment to staff. And the 11th item is also referring to staff the subject matter of an ordinance, this one having to do with occupancy regulations. These are referred to us from the council at our last meeting. Would anyone like to pull any of those items off of consent for discussion or questions? Seeing none, then I will move all the consent items. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Please say no. Those items are approved. Then we'll move on to our public hearings for our land sales. And the first is the land sale at 3234 Humboldt Avenue South, and I believe we'll have a brief staff presentation from this. And I think this is Mr. Ramadan. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, council members. Well, that sounds kind of loud. The sale of 3234 Humboldt Avenue North through Minneapolis Homes policies for the program were established by the City Council on December 11, 2015, and also on February 10, 2017. The staff recommends the sale of 3234 Humboldt Avenue North to Jenny Investments, LLC for its appraised value of $28,000, subject to conditions. 3832 Humboldt was acquired on August 18, 2017 from Hennepin County as tax forfeited land for $10,000. The staff has marketed this property with an open house in October 2017 and with notification to a listserv of now over 1,900 recipients. There were 2 applications received. The other application was from C2W Group. Jenny Investments was ranked higher because of their greater experience in completed projects. C2W Group was not recommended as an alternate purchaser because they have a number of projects already underway, yet to be completed, and are up for 2 more proposed projects today. The property was constructed in 1925 as a 2,054 square foot, 3-bedroom, 1-bath, single-family house. The purchaser intends to invest $149,300 to rehabilitate 3234 Humboldt as a 4-bedroom, 2-bath, single-family home to market exclusively to owner-occupants. CPET's construction management staff reviewed the scope of work and estimates submitted by the applicant and confirmed that they are sufficient to meet the minimum rehabilitation standards of the program. A notification was provided to the Fowle neighborhood on December 12, 2017, and they recommended Jenny Investments. The developer, Jennifer Curria, is actually here today to speak to this as well, and I just wanted to know if there are any questions.
Any committee members have any questions? I don't see any. So then I think what we'll do is we'll just open the public hearing for this one, and I know that you're doing all 3 in a row, but we'll just, I think that's the
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Previous procedure. So thank you very much for that report, and then we'll open the public hearing. Is there anybody here who wishes to speak on this matter? Welcome, and you can state your name and address for the record and then say whatever you want.
My name is Jennifer Courier, and I'm with Jenny Investment. I'll be renovating the house on Humboldt, and thank you for the opportunity to work with the city of Minneapolis.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else who wishes to speak on this? Seeing no one else, then I will close the public hearing, and I would entertain a motion or make a motion. I'll move then that we approve the land sale. Any discussion on the motion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? That motion carries. Now we'll move on to our second land sale public hearing, and this is 3734 Fremont Avenue North.
Again, Mr. Chair, council members, the sale of 3734 Fremont Avenue North was approved through policies for the program established by the City Council on December 11, 2015, and on February 10, 2017. The staff is recommending 3734 Fremont Avenue North be sold to CTW Group for its appraised value of $18,000 subject to conditions. This property was acquired on August the 8th, 2017 from Hennepin County for $1. Staff marketed this property again in October and had over 1,900 people notified of its availability. CTW Group was the only applicant. This property was originally constructed in 1907 as a 1,354 square foot, 2-bedroom, 1-bath, single-family house. CTW Group intends to invest $112,900 to rehabilitate this property as a 2-bedroom, 1-bath, single-family home to be marketed exclusively to owner-occupants. Our construction management staff has looked through their scope of work and has confirmed that they are sufficient to meet the minimum rehabilitation standards. The notification was provided to the Fowler neighborhood again on December 12, 2017 with no comment. Unfortunately, CTW Group developer was unable to be here today. Are there any questions?
I don't see any questions. Thank you so much for the report. And I will just open the public hearing in case somebody wants to speak on this matter. Anybody wish to come forward and speak on it? Seeing no one, then I will close the public hearing, and I will move approval of the land sale. Any discussion? All right. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? That motion carries. Then we have our next one, the fourth item on the agenda. And this one is for 3439 Fremont Avenue North, again in the 4th Ward.
Mr. Chair, this is my final land sale for today. 3439 Fremont Avenue North. This property was acquired on August 8, 2017 from Hennepin County, tax forfeited land for $10,000. We marketed it again to over 1,900 people. CTW Group was the only applicant. This property was constructed in 1909. It's a 1,716 square foot, 3-bedroom, 1-bath, single-family home. The purchaser intends to invest $120,900 to renovate this property as a 3-bedroom, 1-bath, single-family home to be marketed exclusively to owner-occupants. We confirmed that their construction estimates were suitable to meet the minimum rehabilitation standards. The Fowler neighborhood group was notified on December the 12th with no comment, and unfortunately, they're still not here.
Thank you very much.
Sir?
I don't see any questions on this one either. I'll open the public hearing just in case somebody wants to speak on this. Anybody here want to speak on it? Seeing no one, then I'll close the public hearing. Would anyone else like to make a motion on this one? I can move the approval of the land sale then. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Say no. All right, that motion carries. Now we'll move on to our fifth item. And now we can hear from another staff member. And this is there's more than one land sale here, so I'll let you maybe go through how many there are. It's a significant number.
Yes, it is.
So, welcome. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Good afternoon, Chair Gordon and members of the committee. My name is Kevin Canese. I am a senior project coordinator with CPED, and this is my first RCA. I come before you today with a recommendation for the sale of 25 lots to 10 developers and funding through the Minneapolis Homes Development Assistance Program. First, before I request your approval, I'd like to provide a brief overview of the Minneapolis Homes program and provide context about the different proposals that are contained within it.
Thank you.
So the Minneapolis Homes program started first with the infill housing work group that was established in November 20th, 2015 by the City Council. The work group focused on strategies to market, sell, and develop city-owned vacant lots within Minneapolis, as well as increasing affordable housing opportunities while also supporting minority-owned contractors and developers and building wealth in communities where the lots are located. Then in 2017, the City Council approved the Minneapolis Homes program with 3 programmatic goals. The first was the preservation of affordable housing and specifically homeownership opportunities within the city of Minneapolis, the encouragement of new housing development on city-owned lots that are vacant, and improving equitable outcomes in construction, contracting, and homeownership. That action also established the Development Assistance Program component of Minneapolis Homes, which provides project gap funding of up to $70,000 to cover the difference between the project's cost to develop the property and then the amount that it could be appraised for after completion. It also included the homebuyer down payment assistance amount of $5,000 due on sale or $25,000 for long-term affordable properties. And the thing to note with long-term affordable properties is that they are restricted to 80% AMI purchasers in perpetuity, so they have to remain perpetually affordable. And then I should also note that lots in Northeast and South Minneapolis are restricted for long-term affordability. The Minneapolis Homes Development Assistance RFP focused on 4 main criteria, which is equitable outcomes, design that is thoughtful and environmentally friendly, developers that are both efficient and have the financial capacity to do the work that they're doing, and then impact in the communities in which the lots are located. The February 10th action focused on the preservation of affordable ownership opportunities throughout Minneapolis, and the long-term affordability component of that was a major part of that. Before Minneapolis Homes, the predecessor of the program was Green Homes North. Both programs shared very similar program goals and requirements. Both Green Homes North and Minneapolis Homes have a 115% AMI household income restriction. However, it's important to note that most households that actually purchase through the program have a lower income. So with Green Homes North, the average household income was actually 56% of area median income, which is about $51,000. And then getting to the equitable outcomes and homeownership component of the program, 63% of households that purchased were households of color. The second goal was encouraging new housing development on city-owned vacant lots. The first round of funding occurred in 2017 and funded 21 homes, and we are proposing to fund 25 homes with this RCA. The third goal focused on improving equitable outcomes in construction, contracting, and homeownership. And I think it's really important to note that of the developers that are participating, 4 of them are minority-owned businesses, and then of the nonprofits participating, 3 of them have boards that have a 51% or more makeup of women or minority positions. If approved today, the timeline for the Minneapolis Homes Development Assistance Program would see developers close on the lots by August 29th of 2017. So developers would have 6 months to complete due diligence, submit the documentation to the city, and then close on the property, although they would be encouraged to do so sooner if possible. And then they would have a year to complete construction and then sell to a qualified home buyer. So sales would happen in August 29th of 2019 or sooner. And that coincides with the funding requirements that exist with the funders of the program from outside the city. Depicted here is a map of the properties that staff is recommending for approval. As you can see, most of the properties are in North Minneapolis, given to the fact that 80% of the city's inventory that it owns of vacant lots are in North. But we do have 1 property in Northeast Minneapolis and then 5 in South, and those properties would be restricted for long-term affordability. And with that, I just want to give a brief overview of the proposals that we are recommending for funding. So there are 10 developers recommended for 25 lots. And in general, the developments proposed range from about 3 to 4 bedrooms, about 15 to 1,700 square feet, and 2 to 3 bathrooms. The first recommendation is to sell 2 lots in North Minneapolis to Build Wealth Minnesota Incorporated. The second proposal is 4 lots to City of Lakes Community Land Trust. 1 lot is in Northeast Minneapolis, and then 3 are in South Minneapolis. And those are all lots that would have the long-term affordability component restriction. Construction Basics is recommended for 1 lot in North Minneapolis. Eastern Masters is recommended for 1 lot in North Minneapolis. Gimmick, or Greater Metropolitan Housing Corporation, is recommended for 3 lots in North Minneapolis with 2 different home designs. And Ibiza LLC is also recommended for 3 homes in North Minneapolis. Magnolia Homes is recommended for 1 in North Minneapolis. And PRG is recommended for 4 properties. 2 of these are in North Minneapolis, and then 2 are in South Minneapolis. The lots that are in South Minneapolis would have the long-term affordability restriction attached to it through a partnership with the City of Lakes Community Land Trust. Smart Homes is recommended for 2 properties in North Minneapolis. And then Twin Cities Habitat is recommended for 4 properties with 4 different designs, 2 of which are depicted here, and then 2 are depicted here. And I'd like to point out that one of the properties features 5 bedrooms. As part of our RFP, we encourage larger housing units, as that seems to be an area of the city where there's not a lot of availability for larger families. So with that, I want to say thank you and summarize that we as staff are proposing to sell 25 lots to 10 developers and provide $1,913,612 in project gap and homebuyer affordability gap to these projects, and leverage $529,985 from Minnesota Housing and $33,165 from Hennepin County HRA. With that, I'll take any questions.
Well, I have one question. I think you said there was funding to do 25 homes in 2018. And so is this all the homes that we'll be doing this year, or will there be any funds left to do any additional homes?
Good question, Chair Gordon. We anticipate actually doing another round in fall of this year, but it's possible that those lots could then be obligated in 2019, depending on the time frame that occurs in. There is some additional funding that's left over. It's not a significant amount at this point.
It's not significant or not insignificant?
So maybe I misspoke. So there is funding left over for additional lots. If we were to do a RFP of this scale again, it would include additional funding that would be required through like another application through Minnesota Housing Impact Fund, for example.
Okay. So it's certainly what money we have left is less than this. Is it under $500,000?
So we have, and I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, so I apologize.
Around, and if you don't know, I can find out later.
Yes, I could provide that to you at a later date. I apologize.
Thank you. Thank you. I just think this is fantastic news. I know we talk a lot about, and we have over the decades about lots that we can't move and aren't moving forward. So this program seems to have been very successful last year and again this year. So. And
do you mind if I provide a little additional context?
Sure.
So you spoke of the amount that's left over. Another reason that we're awarding the number of lots that we are to developers is we do a capacity evaluation. And as part of that, we want to make sure that we award a number of lots to developers that they are actually capable, in our estimation, based upon our previous experience with them and the application that they submitted, and then doing an award based upon that.
I appreciate that. And it even looked like on this that some of the more well-known developers had more than 1 lot and others had 1. So this might be an opportunity to let somebody start seeing how well they can do this kind of work in this business. And if they're successful, then they can try doing more later. So I appreciate that.
Exactly.
Now, I don't see any other questions or comments at this time. I think we're also supposed to have a public hearing for this. I'm not anticipating a lot of people will come and speak on it, but why don't we take a break and see if anybody wants to speak on it. And then if other council members want to say anything, we can do that then. So I'll open the public hearing. And is there anybody here to speak on this or wants to come up and make a statement? Okay, seeing nobody come forward, then I'll close the public hearing. Any other comments or questions from committee members? Seeing none, then I'll move approval of, there's actually a series of resolutions because there's a separate resolution for every one of the developers who's doing the project. And then we're also authorizing staff to enter into agreements with qualified developers and also to make modifications related to those agreements with the selected developers and entities. So with that motion, I will take a vote. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, say no. Anybody abstaining? That motion carries. And then we're ready to move on to our presentation. And we scheduled this at the right time, I think, because we're still here. I'm so glad. We're going to learn about the innovation team's research into evictions.
I know, but I did the same thing.
Let's see.
There we go. We got it now.
All right.
Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. So Chair Gordon, members of the committee, my name is Zoe Teal, and I'm here today as a member of the Minneapolis Innovation Team as part of the City Coordinator's Office. Thank you for the opportunity to share our team's research into the issue of evictions in Minneapolis for this committee. This is work that I am personally and professionally incredibly proud of and grateful to have this forum and the continued attention on such an important issue. Today, I'll be providing a high-level summary of the research findings, activities currently underway by the city and other partners, as well as recommendations for additional streams of work. There is a more detailed report available on the Innovation Team website for you or members of the public who would like to dig in further into the data. I might get a little more out of breath than usual.
That's all right. Take your time and speak slowly.
Just try to keep it slow. So to start us off today, I just want to ground the conversation in why evictions are an important issue generally and share a little bit about how our team got involved in this research. Many of you may be familiar with the work of Matthew Desmond. He's a sociologist and author of the book Evicted. Nationally, he's really sparked a conversation about evictions and the dual role that tenant evictions have as both a symptom and an underlying cause of poverty and economic instability. He, in his research, found that people of color, particularly Black women, are at higher risk of facing evictions than other groups. And while his research and his book is placed in Milwaukee, the stories and the data of this issue are replicated in Minneapolis and throughout cities across the country. So in the first iteration of the innovation team's work, we focused on the broad priority area of reducing racial disparities in housing, particularly related to rental housing quality, access, and stability. With the backdrop of Desmond's national research and what we as a team heard from community organizations and advocates, it quickly became clear that evictions are a core issue to address. Being evicted is hugely destabilizing for a household. Additionally, we know that for those who have an eviction, even just a filing on their rental record, accessing housing in the future becomes exponentially more difficult. Many property owners are very reluctant to rent to those who have an eviction on their record and may have explicit screening criteria that excludes anyone with an eviction within a certain number of years. It should be noted here that for a renter, even a filing that did not result in actually being removed from housing does show up on a rental record, barring having gone through a formal expungement process. What this tends to mean is that for those renters with an eviction on the record, the rental housing that they can get into in the future may be of significantly lower quality, or property owners may essentially charge a premium for rent or for security deposits. And a quick note about language here before I get too far into the weeds. I'm referring to evictions as both the filing that happens initially at court, as well as an eviction judgment where someone is actually removed from their home. I'll try to be deliberate about differentiating between those two items.
So could I
Yeah.
then ask question right here.
Please.
There are also a lot of instances where somebody's evicted where the system never gets involved, but the landlord just says you have to move out at the end of the month. Did we count those at all, or do we know anything about those? And sometimes it's the threat of maybe going to court that will chase somebody out, or...
Sure. So, Chair Gordon, members of the committee, the data and the research that I am presenting today would not include any of those informal evictions where someone is just being asked to leave. The nature of it is it doesn't get recorded. And so we don't know the level of prevalence of that issue.
Okay, thank you.
Great. And additionally, you may hear evictions sometimes referred to as unlawful detainers or UDs. Those terms are generally interchangeable, and so you can think of those as being the same, one and the same. So in partnership with Housing Link and Homeline, we started with a very high-level analysis of where evictions are taking place. In Minneapolis, the geographic patterns of where evictions are most prevalent aligns neatly with those zip codes with the highest populations of people of color. So on the map that you'll see, those red outlines are zip codes with 50% or more people of color in that area. So particularly in North Minneapolis, zip codes 55411 and 412, the overall numbers and the rate of impact are the highest. We found that over the course of 3 years, an estimated 45 to 48% of renter households have experienced at least one eviction filing. This is a rough estimate. It uses the total count for that zip code compared to the census's estimate of the number of renter households. So it wouldn't reflect cases where the same household experiences violence multiple times or churn in that neighborhood. That said, presuming that this estimate is in the ballpark, it's a staggering figure. Ideally, we would have liked to have been able to measure the specific racial disparities that this represents. And you may be wondering why we're not showing that. The data underlying this map and the rest of the research that I will share primarily comes through the state court records. And in civil court, unlike in criminal court, the race, gender, and other demographics of people involved does not get captured. That said, all it takes is a visit across the street to housing court to see who is being impacted by this issue. An in-person survey conducted by Hennepin County, I believe last summer, captured some demographic information in sort of a man on the street, essentially, survey. And they found that 76% of tenants at housing court identified as African American or American Indian, and 61% identified as female. So the similar trends of Black women being disproportionately impacted that Desmond found in Milwaukee seems to hold true here as well.
Right now, Councilmember Bender?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. This may come up, but I just wanted to note the very basic fact that a little over half of all households in Minneapolis are renter households. And so when you're looking at the map where you were showing the percentage of renter households who are impacted by eviction, in particular wards or neighborhoods in our city, that's a very high percentage of the overall population. And so I just wanted to note that so we have a sense of the magnitude of the number of households and families that are being impacted by either the instability that Councilmember Gordon described or formal evictions that you're talking about.
Thank you.
So once we had a sense of where evictions were happening and to whom, we wanted to dig deeper into the why. Tenant advocates and attorneys that work with tenants at housing court told us nearly all evictions are filed for non-payment of rent. And as we found in our research, the data bears that out. Myself and others on our team conducted a detailed case file review of a random selection of 2015 filings. This means actually reading one by one through about 100 or so cases that were representative sampling. And on the filing document that landlords fill out at housing court, the owner or manager can select from 6 sort of pre-populated reasons why they're filing for the eviction. This includes non-payment, failure to vacate after notice is given, breach of lease or covenants, mortgage foreclosure, or contract for deed default. In the Minneapolis cases that we reviewed, non-payment of rent was the reason provided 93% of the time. In cases of non-payment, the amounts owed were generally in the $1,700 to $2,000 range, representing 1 to 3 months rent owed. So both of those are figures that an owner would provide on the filing paperwork to indicate how much is owed and for how many months. Additionally, it's typical that the filing fee, though that is initially paid by the property owner or landlord, that would be charged back to the renter at the point of a settlement or included in the requirements for an ultimate eviction order. So that is something that the plaintiff, the landlord in this case, has a right to ask to be repaid on that filing fee if they prevail. At the time of this analysis, that fee was $324. They've now reduced it to $299. And for some tenants that have very low amounts owed, that additional filing fee can be a pretty significant percentage. Getting at the underlying why rent was going unpaid, there's a little less information formally available. Anecdotally, again, talking to tenant organizations, legal aid representatives, there's a pretty even mix of those tenants who, due to financial emergencies or other household strain, are unable to pay their rent, or in housing situations that are consistently unaffordable, and those who may have withheld rent in an attempt to try to get repair issues addressed. While there is a provision in Minnesota state law for a tenant to withhold rent if repairs are not being completed by a landlord, to be protected from an eviction, they actually do need to file what's called a rent escrow case and to pay rent amounts to the court until that issue is resolved. That process is not always well understood and may not always be a practical option for some households. So I'll go more into more detail about some of the current and future efforts later in the presentation, but I would highlight here that there are multiple research efforts that are aimed at getting a better understanding of what's happening financially and otherwise in households that are getting behind in rent. This includes a community-based research project through Cura that will be grounded in interviews with individuals and households who've experienced eviction, as well as a data analysis through Hennepin County to examine how connected or disconnected households experiencing eviction are to other social services.
We have a couple questions, I think, about this slide.
Okay.
Councilmember Ellison?
Thank you so far for the presentation. I had some questions around, you talked about the contract for deed. My understanding is that it can be pretty difficult to follow contract for deed because technically the tenant is the homeowner. How difficult or successful did you all feel in being able to navigate and track the number of evictions that were happening via, like, within that contract for deed scenario?
Sure. Chair Gordon, Councilmember Ellison, I will say that particular question is a little bit outside of my knowledge base on the research. The number of filings for eviction that are related to contract for deed are such a small proportion of the overall that I don't have a good sense of it. Thank you.
And then I can't remember my second question, but I'll think of it later if I remember.
I'll be here for a while.
Yeah, thank you.
Councilmember Goodman has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So have you guys analyzed who the most frequent evictors are? So it would seem to me that there must be a core group of people who practice this as a business practice, and then there's probably a large group of people who are not involved in evicting people at all. And so I hate to, because rental housing is so important in the city, I hate to paint every landlord with a brush, and it would be good if we could know, or at least discuss, who seems to fall back on eviction after one rent not paid. I'm not sure if I'm ahead of what you were going to comment on, but it just seems to me as though there would be some names and we might want to discuss that.
Yes.
Thank you.
As I recall, I think there's 25 property owners who are responsible for most of the evictions, but
Chair Gordon, Councilmember Goodman, that is the next slide. If after this slide you still have questions, do ask them. So another critical angle that our research examined was who are the property owners that are filing evictions? For this analysis, we took a snapshot of all 2015 Minneapolis filings, scrubbed that data and cross-reference it with the data we have from our rental licenses. So big picture, on average, among property owners who had filed at least one case in 2015, there was an annual rate of about 5%. So for every 100 housing units, there are actually 100 little windows in this clip art here. It's the small things. So they're about a 5% rate of filing. And of those, about 2 actually ended in an eviction judgment. What we found, however, is that this rate really varied widely among property owners. 10 owners filed over a quarter of the eviction filings in that year. Those owners, the sort of frequent filers, if you will, represented a couple of basic types. So there were the ownership groups that simply have very large portfolios and almost necessarily then had a higher number of filings than those with smaller portfolios. And so they didn't necessarily have an unusual rate, they just have a lot of properties. The second group, there are also owners who were on that list of the 10 filing the 25% because their rates were very high. And this second group includes property owners who also have frequent housing violations and whose property portfolios include tier 2 and 3 properties per our rental licensing. Some had rates as higher than 100%, indicating that they had actually filed more evictions than they had rental units. So some units were being filed on multiple times over that year. This speaks to a particular kind of business model that may include features like having loose screening criteria, including accepting those with prior evictions who may be at higher risk in the future, taking high security deposits, minimizing maintenance, and having frequent churn of tenants. In the full report that's available on the innovation team's website, we've got a full list of the 25 or so at the top, as well as the rates of some of our largest property ownership groups. A special case I would point out here is actually the Minneapolis Public Housing Authority. So they have more rental units than anybody else in the city. So they have what is a very average rate, but their total numbers are pretty high. And this issue is something that we've been in touch with MPHA staff and are examining some strategies that they may put in place to reduce specifically the filings among public housing residents.
We have another question, Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. How does the 5% compare to other cities of our size? Is that higher than other cities, or can you give me a comparable set?
Sure. Chair Gordon, Councilmember Goodman, this is an area where there is not great comparative data available. However, Matthew Desmond's new evictions lab out of Princeton is sometime this spring going to be planning to release data sets. They've sort of bought up the tenant screening data that's behind this for the whole country and are going to be rolling out some comparative tools that will allow us to do that.
Chair?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What about cities like St. Paul? So, I mean, it would seem that they would have the same data set that we would have, the same housing court that we would have. I mean, it's hard for me to tell whether or not 5% is a lot or a little when you can't compare it to anything.
Yeah, Chair Goodman, Chair Gordon, Councilmember Goodman, pardon me. I do not have St. Paul's rate on hand, but that is something that we could calculate.
Be good to do some more research. I think on other cities would be helpful to have a template. Yeah. I'll also note that we've been joined by Council Members Cano and Cunningham. Thank you so much for being here. It shows that this is an issue I think all city council members care about.
Great. So the last slide I would share with sort of the data summary, we wanted to capture what usually happens after an eviction is filed. What we found from our review is that overall, about half of cases that get filed result in an eviction judgment, either initially or at some point in the process. This is what when the housing court referee writes an order that the tenant must leave. It's also called a writ of recovery, is the legal term that you may hear. So there are a couple of reasons why so many initial filings are going to result in a judgment. Part of this reason is that what we found was that 1 in 3 tenants do not actually show up to their first hearing, whether because they had logistical barriers like transportation, childcare, work schedules, or because they assumed it wouldn't be worth their time to show up. They assumed they would be kicked out anyways and just didn't show, or for some other reason. So when this happens, when a tenant doesn't show up to the hearing, the property owner can ask for an immediate judgment to be ordered, and they typically do ask for that, and that is something that the referees would then issue. Additionally, although most cases do reach a settlement at the first hearing, 40% of those settlements fail, at which point the owner can again request an immediate judgment. Most settlement agreements are payment plans, although some will also include an agreed upon move-out date in addition to some payment amount. I would just interject here that if the picture in your head of hearings and settlements is anything like mine was prior to the start of this work, you may need to reset that picture. Part of getting some basic grounding in this process for me personally was to sit in on a few housing court hearings just across the street over at the Hennepin County building. Those are open to the public. If you're interested, I'd encourage it. That observation was a really great learning opportunity for me. What this really looks like is there are a dozen or more tenants who are all scheduled for a mass hearing at a particular time of day, almost none of whom have attorneys, along with the property owners and frequently the owner's attorneys. The settlement agreement process includes the tenant and either the owner or the owner's lawyer having a 5-minute conversation in the hallway, writing out a payment plan on a piece of paper. The hearing that follows, when I attended, was about 60 to 90 seconds apiece. And while I found the referees to be nothing but respectful and polite to all parties involved, the pace of that was certainly not what I pictured when I pictured a court proceeding. Legal aid and volunteer lawyers do have housing court, or do staff housing court, and tenants who get representation from an attorney do have better outcomes, which is why there's been an increased investment from the county. I believe in the city and CPED's budget, there's some money for additional tenant legal support, as well as from some nonprofit organizations have been putting additional money into this. But there is still nowhere near universal representation available. Again, it is civil court. It is not like criminal court where you are guaranteed an attorney.
Councilmember Bender?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick question. You said earlier that the filing of an eviction goes on someone's record.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us why that is? Is there a law, and at what level of government is the law
Sure.
that says that a filing goes on?
Yes. Chair Gordon, Councilmember Bender, to the best of my understanding, the laws that govern that are primarily the public records laws at the state level. And that sort of says how long things like your credit score and rental history can show up in a screening process. I will say that in this particular case, if you were really dedicated to finding out the information about a particular tenant, technically that information is public data indefinitely. And while it drops off of screening services records in 7 years, if you were to go down to the courthouse and look up an individual, it would be indefinitely accessible.
Councilmember Schrader?
Yeah, on that point, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's something just from public record of the filing of the eviction. It's not even a finding. It's even before going through court, having that UD on your record is the thing that is crippling.
Chair Gordon, Councilmember Schrader, that's right. Yeah.
Councilmember Ellison?
Whose responsibility is it to inform people about the rent escrow process? Because I know that, before getting ready to run, I think consider myself pretty involved. Even I didn't know about this process. I think the average person doesn't know. Who's in charge of informing folks?
Chair Gordon, Councilmember Ellison, I'm not sure that there's anyone in charge of informing tenants about this. Certainly, the state courts manage the process, and groups like Legal Aid, Homeline certainly do advocacy and try to push out that information, but I'm not sure that there is one entity that is solely responsible for that.
And this is maybe not a question that you can fully answer, but we could potentially avoid at least a number of these situations if folks knew how to protest their landlords adequately, right? And we end up working on that on the back end, right? And so it seems like some more proactive political education or public education could be really needed here. So
yeah, Chair Gordon, Councilmember Ellison, certainly if more people took advantage of the rent escrow process, there would be some cases that could be avoided. I don't know the sort of scale exactly, but there would certainly be some. All right, so now I want to transition away from what the data is telling us about the current reality to what we can do about it. The first way I'd ask you to think about this is the level of outcomes we want to impact on this issue. First and foremost should be prevention. The best outcome is to avoid a filing from happening in the first place. However, there is also progress that can be made on mitigating the negative outcomes of a filing. This means, having fewer filings leading to a judgment, having more successful settlements, more instances of tenant redemption or trial wins, for example. And finally, we want to reduce the number and impact of having that eviction on your rental record. This can include increased expungement efforts, changes to laws around the length of records retention, or working with property owners to modify their screening criteria to allow more tenants with prior evictions. This framing and the baseline data I shared with you today gives us a great basis for setting some broad strategies to achieve those outcomes. Reducing filings, judgments, and their negative consequences is not something that the city or any other entity can do on their own. The levers for improvement sit with our partners in county government, in the courts, nonprofit, legal, and advocacy organizations, public and other mission-driven housing providers, private housing providers, and beyond. Our work as an innovation team in 2016 and 17 has been to convene many of these players and support the development of the targeted strategies that different players can take on. Overall, these strategies include, first, working to get ahead of the problem, intervening early to get the rent paid on time. Second, proactively addressing repair issues to avoid the problem of rent withholding mentioned earlier. Third, we want evictions to be a last resort for property owners, finding options for resolving issues, whether non-payment or otherwise. And fourth, we want to ensure that tenants are supported in reaching the most positive outcomes possible in court and beyond where filings do still occur. While I won't go into all of the partner actions that are underway, I will highlight a couple examples. So Hennepin County has launched a pilot eviction prevention program at North Point Health to provide financial assistance, legal assistance, case management support, and more to individuals who are facing a potential eviction. And that financial assistance is a pot of money with a few fewer strings attached than their typical emergency assistance dollars. Community Action Hennepin County also has a dedicated fund for eviction prevention. Legal Aid is looking at hiring a tenant outreach coordinator to support proactive strategies for working with tenants in high eviction, poorly maintained properties, funded by Family Housing Fund and in partnership with the city and community agencies. I believe that's a pretty new approval. There's been added funding for tenant legal assistance at Housing Court from the POLAD Foundation, and additional research, as mentioned, by Cura and Hennepin County, as well as work done by the U of M to develop new tools for monitoring trends, looking at how specific owner portfolios are looking, having that kind of resource available. So finally, I want to address, to get to the actions that the city can, and in some cases has already started taking to address high evictions. So what are listed here are the general recommendations from our team, which we continue to be in discussion with those departments most closely involved. So hopefully for our partners here in the room, these are not surprising. First, as a city, we have a unique role in licensing rental property and enforcing housing code. The tiered licensing model created a framework for regulatory services to distribute inspections resources where they're most needed. And we believe that there's room within our management and legal tools to address property portfolios with persistent high levels of violations that may also be those high frequent filer portfolios for evictions. This could include anything from looking at the use of conditions on rental licenses to working with external partners on tenant remedies actions or acquisition strategies. Second, and of particular relevance to this committee, could include a re-examination of the city's current conduct on premise ordinance. This policy and the associated practices are an underlying cause of some number of tenant evictions. The conduct and license premise ordinance requires a license holder to take appropriate action following specific criminal disorderly conduct by tenants or their guests. And in practice, this may mean that property owners are directed by the city to evict a tenant, even if there may be a different action that could meet that same goal. While there may be community safety value in having a tool like this, undoubtedly, I believe it's worth asking the question of what benefit are we getting from this policy and what is the cost of it? Are there revisions that could support that core benefit while minimizing the impact on displacement? Third, many of the governing laws, the laws governing evictions and the related issues are set at a state level. So as part of the development of a city legislative agenda, specific items to consider supporting could include legislation like instituting requirement of advance notice of filing, commonly known as pay or quit. That's something that has perennially come up in at the state legislature. Limiting the amount of time that an eviction shows up in a tenant's record, expanding the allowable uses of expungement, which could include automatic expungement when a case is dismissed or found in favor of the tenant, which is not the current policy. Fourth, some of the tenant assistance tools aren't necessarily best delivered by the city, but can be supported through city funding. In particular, thinking about expanded legal assistance. That's a strategy that has been effective elsewhere. And finally, there are policy tools that other cities have adopted that may be worth exploring and adapting to our particular context. For example, Seattle and a few other cities have adopted just cause eviction ordinances that require property owners to have a just cause to terminate a tenancy. And New York City passed a law that guarantees legal representation to any low-income tenant facing eviction. No city appears to have figured it all out, but there are opportunities to learn about promising practices as evictions and displacement are rising in the national conversation about housing. Evictions are a critical issue to address to support racial equity in housing, housing quality, access, and stability. While this is a complex challenge with no one solution, I am fully convinced that dramatically reducing evictions in Minneapolis is possible. And I'm greatly encouraged by the work of staff and partners to move the dial. With that, I will take additional questions you may have.
I think we might have some more
As best
questions.
I can.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the presentation. Councilmember Schrader.
So I thank so much for this presentation, and I want to thank your whole team. This is just fantastic to really look into such a critical part of what's happening in the city. I wanted to, I like a lot of the solutions. I know a lot of that work's already been done. Just a quick question on if there have been solutions that go out that don't require going to court. Just hearing this list, working with kind of low wealth communities, going to court's a huge barrier. So even if you're able to get an attorney, that's still a process that's inaccessible to other people. So I'm just trying to see from a scope from looking nationally if there have been kind of other options that are out there.
Chair Gordon, Councilmember Schrader, if I understand your question, you're thinking about how are there ways to get these cases resolved without going through a court process?
I can give you an example.
Okay.
So just rent escrow.
Yeah.
So some folks moved to the Twin Cities. They lived in a place where you did not have to go to court to file a rent escrow. You could simply, you just had to show notice, and you had to make sure that money was there and prove that in court if it got that far. Something like that would, instead of escalating it right to court before you have protections, something that gave tenants protections without having to take that extra step, if that makes sense.
Sure. Chair Gordon, Councilmember Schrader, I think in our context, that process would be governed by the state laws around that issue. And so we could certainly look at the comparison with other cities that have different legal contexts.
Councilmember Ellison.
I didn't so much had a question. I just kind of I felt like there's some context around evictions and maybe around our broader housing conversation that I feel like is important to really set. I think about in a city like Minneapolis where geography and race and income are maybe shamefully predictable, right? We know where Black folks in the city live. We know where Indigenous people live. We know where different immigrant populations live and where white people live. In a city like that, our maps aren't really all that surprising, right? At nearly 50% for North Minneapolis of evictions, it's hard to not look at that number and the perimeter of those numbers and not see potentially a 50-plus year problem that we're staring down. And I just feel like it's important to name that. I know that something like redlining always sort of gets dropped rhetorically when people want to get like applause, right? But taking it more seriously, I think that looking at that map really sets in context just how long, like just the historical effects of something like redlining or housing covenants that specifically named that, Black folks could not live here, immigrant populations could not live here, Indigenous folks could not live here. And as we have these conversations, the harms were that specific and named who the intended harm was for, but our solutions often aren't as specific. They're a lot less specific. And so I'm really interested in figuring out, I think some creative solutions are overdue when it comes to figuring out how we create specific solutions to harms that were, that were that specific and that named. So I just wanted to provide that context and make sure that my colleagues also were considering that as we have conversations around evictions and housing in general. So thank you.
Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a number of questions that you might not know the answer to, so it's not meant as a quiz, but
Sure.
When you were speaking earlier about, like from the very first slides about percentages, I wondered if you have a sense of the raw numbers of the number of households or people in Minneapolis who are evicted every year.
Chair Gordon, Councilmember Bender, so it is about 3,000 filings per year on average over the last 5 years or so.
That's helpful, and that's for a household, so that may affect many people per filing.
Correct. That would be the number of cases, and
Yeah.
so an individual case or filing may include multiple defendants.
Great. Okay, thank you. And then, is there any reason to evict a tenant that is not protected by a lease, who is on a month-to-month lease? Or said another way, do the evictions include people who are on month-to-month leases, or are they typically for people who are protected by a longer lease?
Chair Gordon, Councilmember Bender, it could apply in either case. A court filing could occur where there is just a verbal lease. I don't know the prevalence of one versus the other, but if the property owner has told someone to leave and they haven't, regardless of the type of lease, that may show up as a eviction filing.
Do you know how many renters in our city have month-to-month leases or verbal leases versus a longer term
I do not.
legal agreement? Okay. Anecdotally, in my ward, when Councilmember Gordon was talking about the folks who aren't captured by your research because they're they're losing their homes not through a formal eviction process, through rent increases or for being asked to leave or being intimidated by their landlords. I see that frequently in buildings where people do not have the protection of a lease. So it's another area of interest of mine, is understanding if there are ways that we can incentivize or require people to have the legal protection, or at least be offered the protection of a lease. These buildings that are sold and then rents significantly increased in the 10th ward and across the city, again, often they don't have leases, and they get, days notice to decide if they want to stay on the next month. And I know we're working on some policy change to increase the amount of time that people would have to make that decision, but is extremely disruptive in people's lives to have to make a decision to leave or stay in a home where they may have lived for a decade or more. I also wondered if we have any partnership with our schools around, around this issue of families who may fall into that category of non-payment of rent for financial issues, or if there's opportunity to explore that.
Sure. Chair Gordon, Councilmember Bender, I don't know the specific relationship. I would, my best assumption is that would be most likely between the county and the Minneapolis Public Schools Homeless and Highly Mobile Office, but that is something I can check in on.
I'll just mention, again, just for the benefit of my colleagues, I was talking with a school board member last week, and he and I were discussing our school-based clinics, which is a partnership between the school district and the city, and I think the presentation just came through the health committee, Councilmember Cunningham chairs, and we've often discussed an ability to expand those school-based clinics beyond just the high schools. But you might think about a way that we could also support more wraparound services in schools, like legal services or access to information. And we were particularly talking about the idea of focusing any kinds of additional resources or programs in green zones or in other way to sort of geographically define where we would want to prioritize that. And I just finally wanted to say that when I read Evicted, one of the things that I noted was the way that the book talked about landlords. And to Councilmember Goodwin's point, I think it's important that we take aggressive action to protect renters. I also know that people who own land and who are landlords come from all walks of life too. And I think to think about supportive ways that we can help those who actually may need help as landlords and resources without letting those stories be exploited for, in a way that would limit our ability to help protect the vulnerable renters in our city. So I think often when we look at regulatory approaches to issues, we start to hear these really hard stories. We heard a lot of them during our Earn, Save, and Sick and minimum wage discussions, where we did hear from small business owners who were struggling, right? And we want to find ways to help support business owners and landlords in our city that are struggling. But I also think it's important for us to keep in mind this broader perspective of the scope of this problem in our city. And I appreciated the approach that you took to looking at ways we could focus first on landlords that may be evicting high numbers of people, but I also think, like as a number of my colleagues have been asking, some of these regulatory approaches are probably overdue in our city, and I know there's a lot of interest in them.
Thank you very much. Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you, Chair Gordon. Thank you so much for this presentation and letting me crash in. I have a couple of questions. The first is, and I apologize if I maybe missed it at the beginning, but is this data disaggregated by single-family homes versus apartments?
Chair Gordon, Councilmember Cunningham, there is a way for this specific subset we scrubbed to compare with rental licenses that we could look at that. I don't know that I have that data off the top of my head.
The reason why I ask is just because it seems to be a very high frequency in the fourth ward because we have a large single family housing stock. And so feels like that want to make sure that single family homes don't get lost in the conversation. A lot of times we talk about, when we talk about rentals, we're talking about apartments. And so I've taken a particular interest even before getting elected around the conduct on premises ordinance. It was written in the early 90s, so it's really time for it to be revamped. It's a behavioral policy, so I was just curious as to if MPD has been involved, like with this recommendation, was MPD involved with it because they are the ones who implement it? And have they provided any data on that and where that recommendation? I would just like to get more information on why the recommendations are being made, because I can say that I know from my ward that that the conduct on premises ordinance has been really ineffective in addressing these issues.
Chair Gordon, Councilmember Cunningham, that is a conversation that is ongoing between Regulatory Services and MPD. I don't think it's a spoiler to say we've got a conversation scheduled for tomorrow to dig deeper in that, but they are involved in that conversation.
Mr. Schuckman, did you want to add something to that?
No, I can just thank you, Mr. Chair. Noah Schuckman, Director of Regulatory Services, and Mr. Chair, Councilmember, to your question, Chief Arredondo and I have had a number of productive conversations about that ordinance and looking at some of the unintended consequences that have come out of it. And to Zoe's point, we do have a meeting tomorrow to continue that conversation and expect to continue making progress on that.
Thank you very much. I guess I just had one question, wondering if you have any information on this. We talked about maybe a limited number of landlords who are responsible for a lot of this, and I think I got the impression when I was looking at the book Evicted that there's also this is a lifestyle that some people end up getting stuck in terms of their housing, where they're somewhere, they get evicted, and then they struggle for a while, maybe they're homeless, and then they find another place to live, and they're there for a while, and they get evicted. And I got this impression that sometimes they even end up back at one of the other places where they were evicted from, and it's as if they're being cycled through a series of places. Do we have any idea how many people repeat this within the 5 years we looked at, or anything like that?
Yeah. Chair Gordon, the trend that you're pointing to is definitely prevalent in the research through Desmond of for those who have been evicted previously, they are going to be at higher risk of being evicted in the future, in part because that is an economic shock that puts you even farther behind. From the data in Minneapolis, we were not able to track repeats of individual tenants. The level of identifiable data is limited to name and an address that is no longer their address. And so that tracking was not possible with the data we had.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. The last thing that I wanted to say too is that it looks like to me that most of the information that you have is actually living somewhere on an M drive that council members don't have access to and the public doesn't either. So you referenced a report and more information that we could access. What I would like to see is if we could put that on the city website and have it linked to our agenda. So whatever you have that is you think is public information or should be, let's post it up there so we can dig deeper into the details if we want to as a council or staff, but also so the public has access to it. So maybe you can work with Irene and get that.
Happy to do that.
All right, thank you very much. Any other final comments? Councilmember Elson.
I just had a question. Do we know how many of the non-payment evictions were non-payment because of rapid increases in rent? And if not, is that something we can suggest Cura put into their survey?
Chair Gordon, Councilmember Ellison, we do not know. We don't know that from the court records.
Okay.
I believe that in the research that Cura is doing, their whole idea is to unravel why it was that a tenant wasn't paying rent. So we may not know it in a statistically reliable form, but we will have some better sort of case studies and exemplars.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
I don't see any other comments or questions. This has been very helpful, very informative. I think we'll probably see some action coming up in terms of policy from the council in the weeks ahead. The only action we have to take on it, I guess, is to move to receive and file. So I'll make that motion. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, that is taken care of, and then there's no further business before us, so this meeting is adjourned.